World War II technically began in 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. But if we're being honest, the fire had been building long before that. The world was still licking its wounds from World War I, the war to end all wars, which obviously didn't work out that way. Countries were broke, angry, and suspicious of each other. The Treaty of Versailles had humiliated Germany, and the rise of dictators like Hitler, Mussolini, and Japan's militarist leaders pushed nations back towards the edge. Add in a global depression, unstable borders, and a whole lot of unresolved tension, and you got a planet gearing up for another massive fight. Let's get into it. Tier 1. Final Solution Atrocities. 1933 to 1945. When most people think of World War II, they picture the popular stories, the ones Hollywood loves. You know, tanks rolling through muddy fields, soldiers lighting cigarettes after battle, planes flying over Europe in perfect formation. You know, that type of stuff. But even the familiar tales have teeth, starting with the final solution. For years before the war kicked off, Hitler and the Nazis were already planting the seeds of genocide. They blamed Jewish people for everything. Losing World War I, the economy tanking, even the so-called collapse of traditional values. Repeat the lie enough times and eventually the crowd starts to cheer. When Hitler became chancellor in 1933, the hate against Jews slowly turned into anti-Jewish laws. They smeared swastikas on shops, carried out humiliating public beatings, and torched synagogues. Then came the ghettos, where people starved behind walls and had to eat garbage to survive. But that was just a warm-up. By 1941, Nazi leadership, under Hitler's directives, gave the green light for full-blown genocide. The SS and their helpers shot Jews by the thousands in forests after forcing them to dig their own graves. Some victims were lined up and shot into mass graves, sometimes still breathing when the next body landed. Others were crammed into gas vans, choking on carbon monoxide, as German soldiers stood outside, waiting for the banging on the walls to stop. The genocide was cold and systematic, but it wasn't efficient enough, so they built death factories in Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor, places where trains arrived packed with human cargo, men, women, children, and within hours, most were dead. The victims were stripped and shaved. Children, elders, and even entire families vanished into gas chambers, disguised as showers. Zyklon B did the job in minutes. Screams, banging, desperation, and then silence. Even in death, the captives suffered horrible indignities. Their bodies were burned in crematoria or tossed into pits. The Nazis kept records, photos, jewelries, and even the hair of their victims. They also held on to things like gold teeth pulled from their victims' corpses as if they were some kind of trophy. By the time the war ended, 6 million Jews were gone, along with millions of Roma, disabled people, Poles, and Soviet POWs. Not killed in battle, erased. Their homes looted, their graves unmarked, their names left only in lists. Nanjing. Before Auschwitz and Hiroshima became the defining horrors of World War II, the streets of Nanjing ran red. Across the Pacific, Japanese soldiers committed horrors that could rival anything that happened in Europe. The 1937 Nanjing Massacre was horrifyingly violent, and that's putting it mildly. The Japanese Empire saw itself as racially superior and used that belief to justify war crimes across Asia. When Japanese forces stormed the Chinese capital in December 1937, they went beyond trying to win a war and did horrible things that blurred the line between soldier and sadist. The invasion followed months of slaughter as the Japanese advanced from Shanghai. In this time, the countryside between Shanghai and Nanjing turned into a graveyard. Japanese soldiers burned villages, shot civilians for sport, and tortured women with such cruelty that it's hard to talk about without your stomach churning. By the time they reached Nanjing, the soldiers were already well-versed in monstrous butchery. But the capital was where things really went to shit. Once the city fell, the Japanese army went completely feral. The order was simple: kill all captives. And they didn't just follow it, they enjoyed it. The soldiers murdered tens of thousands of prisoners of war and random men on the streets, rounding them up like cattle and opening fire without hesitation. Not even the teenagers or the elderly were safe. And the women, they weren't spared either. Neither were little girls. Violation became a weapon of war, and it didn't matter to the men that some of the victims were babies. The survivors, if you can even call them that, were often killed right after in ways so grotesque they would have you questioning your faith in humanity, assuming you had any. One of the most infamous events was the so-called killing contest between two Japanese officers. The rules: first to 100 kills with a sword wins. Simple, horrifying, and treated like a game. Newspapers in the area covered it like it was a baseball game. They even put together a makeshift score sheet. By the time it was over, one guy had racked up 105 kills, the other 106, but they never officially declared a winner. The bombing of London, 1940 to 1941. Back in the West, Churchill was giving his trademark fire up the nation speeches while Londoners slept in subways, hiding from German bombs. The first bombs dropped on a Saturday night. At first, most people figured it was just another false alarm until the sirens started going off, the planes started humming, and the sky lit up like the end of days. London had just barely made it through the Battle of Britain, and now it was about to get something even worse. An 8-month-long firestorm campaign known as the Blitz. When the Luftwaffe locked in on the capital, they came with fuel, fire, and a plan to shatter the nation's spirit. From September 1940 to May 1941, London got hit almost every night. Streets disappeared. Buildings that had been standing since Shakespeare's time were reduced to bricks and ash. Families hid in basements and underground stations, praying the next hit wouldn't take them with it. The noise never let up. The fires were basically impossible to put out, and there were so many bodies that funerals had to wait. Some were buried under rubble, and others were abandoned in makeshift morgues. On one especially rough night in December 1940, the city basically caught fire. Bombs hit all over central London and kicked off the Second Great Fire. St. Paul's Cathedral was surrounded by flames, and the blaze was so big it could be seen from miles away. To make matters worse, London wasn't the only one getting roasted. Coventry got leveled. Liverpool's docks were hit so often they might as well have come pre-labeled with bullseyes. Even sleepy little Hull got bombed so frequently it became the Luftwaffe's go-to backup target. Eventually, precision bombing turned into, let's just drop things and hope for the best. Hospitals, churches, homes, nothing was off limits. The bombs didn't care what they hit. By the end, whole cities looked less like places people lived and more like graveyards. But here's the twist. It didn't break the British spirit. The Nazis figured people would panic and fold. Instead, it had the opposite effect. War production kept going. Factories moved. And the British, running on tea, spite, and sheer stubbornness, started rebuilding before the smoke even cleared. The Battle of Stalingrad, 1942. By the early 40s, Hitler and the Nazis were cocky, convinced that Soviet Union was already beaten. After blitzing through Poland, smashing France, and humiliating Britain at Dunkirk, the Nazis believed they were unstoppable. In 1941, Hitler broke his pact with Stalin and launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history. Over 3 million Axis troops stormed into the Soviet Union, expecting a quick victory. Instead, they ran into endless mud, ice, and resistance. By the summer of 1942, Germany was bleeding from 1,000 cuts, but still pushing east. Hitler shifted his obsession southward to a symbolic Soviet city bearing Stalin's name, Stalingrad. It wasn't just about strategy anymore. This was a deadly pissing contest. In response, Stalin issued Order Number 227, not a step back. The Soviet army was to defend the city to the death if need be. In the Battle of Stalingrad, Soviet soldiers froze in rubble while German troops were slowly starved, shot, or shattered by artillery. Whole city blocks were reduced to smoking cinders. The Luftwaffe rained over 1,000 tons of explosives in a single day, turning the city into a giant furnace. Some estimates say 40,000 civilians were wiped out in those first days alone. Others pushed the numbers closer to 70,000, and still the Soviets refused to let the city go. German tanks rumbled through the ruins, but every meter they gained, they paid for in blood. The Soviets clung to their positions like they were chained to them. Stalin even banned civilians from evacuating, gambling that their presence would raise the stakes. And it worked. The defenders fought from trenches carved into city rubble, from factory floors covered with grease and blood, and buildings so riddled with bullets they barely stood upright. One Soviet platoon packed themselves into a single apartment block and fought from there for 60 days straight. According to some accounts, they killed more Germans from that one building than the Nazis lost taking all of Paris. Still, Hitler refused to let his troops pull out. The German 6th Army got surrounded in November during Operation Uranus, and the trap slammed shut. Freezing, starving, and running out of ammo, German soldiers huddled in cellars eating horse meat and snow. The Luftwaffe tried to supply them from the air, but it was too little too late. The Soviets didn't break. At the end, they were the ones surrounding the invaders. The proud 6th Army, once one of Hitler's most elite, surrendered en masse in February. By this point, Stalingrad had become a frozen hell. Nearly 2 million people were killed, wounded, or captured. Hitler killed his own. Erwin Rommel was a German war general who had already made a name for himself in World War I after successfully capturing key Italian positions, including towns like Longarone. In fact, he earned his country's top military honor, the Pour le Mérite, which is basically the congrats you're terrifyingly good at war badge. But it was in World War II in North Africa that Rommel really locked in on his legacy. That's where he earned his nickname, the Desert Fox. Rommel was known for playing war clean, at least by messed up standards of the time. His British enemies actually respected him. Some even said that the North African campaign felt like a war without hate. But let's not get too carried away. The Nazis still committed atrocities in that region, including targeting Jewish communities, and whether Rommel looked the other way or just didn't know is still up for debate. What we do know is that he was no fanboy of the SS, and he kept his distance from a lot of the Reich's darker schemes. But don't mistake distance for innocence. He wasn't some rebel saint. He liked Hitler well enough in the early years, and his rise to field marshal wasn't exactly an accident. Fast forward to 1944. Things are looking rough for Germany, and a group of officers who were fed up with Hitler's suicidal leadership style decided it was time to send the Führer to the afterlife. Rommel wasn't exactly in on the plot to assassinate Hitler, but he knew about it. The Nazi top brass caught wind and decided he had to go. And Hitler, ever the drama queen, didn't want to publicly execute Germany's golden boy. It would risk crushing the people's morale. So instead, he sent 2 generals to Rommel's house with a briefcase full of cyanide and 2 options. Option 1, go to trial, get executed, and drag your whole family down with you. Option 2, take the pill, die quietly, go out as a hero. And your family gets to keep the house, the honor, and the pension. Rommel got into the car, took the pill, and died by the side of a road. Hitler threw a grand funeral and told the world he died from wounds sustained in an earlier airstrike. But after the war, Allied intelligence interviewed Rommel's widow and son, and the real story of his forced suicide came out. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. By 1945, Japan was hanging by a thread, and cities were being erased from the map like pencil sketches. Tokyo, Osaka, and dozens more burned to ash in massive firebomb raids. And when it seemed like things couldn't get worse, the US dropped a new kind of weapon that redefined destruction itself. Innovation came bearing a deadly gift, and proved there's no ceiling to how far humans will go to win a war. The Americans had been cooking something in secret, deep in the desert, with enough funding to rival a small nation. The US quietly built a weapon the world had never seen, the atomic bomb. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay flew over Hiroshima and dropped a little metal contraption with a cruelly ironic name. It was called Little Boy. A few seconds later, the sky lit up like a second sun. And in a matter of seconds, Hiroshima's center was obliterated. Buildings crumbled, glass melted, steel burned, and an estimated 90,000 people were gone, just like that. People were incinerated instantly. Some left as shadows on walls, others disfigured beyond recognition. Bodies were blackened, bloated, or burned alive where they stood. And somehow that still wasn't the end. 3 days later, while the survivors in Hiroshima were still struggling to grasp what had happened, another B-29 showed up, this time headed for Nagasaki. The bomb on board was named Fat Man, and it packed an even bigger punch. When it dropped, the city didn't stand a chance. Fire, radiation, and utter chaos swallowed almost everything in seconds. Between the 2 bombings, over 200,000 people died. Some in seconds, others over agonizing weeks from radiation, infection, and internal collapse. 6 days later, Japan surrendered. Tier 2. Dachau. Opened in 1933 to imprison political enemies like communists and social democrats. But like everything the Nazis touched, it quickly became a nightmare factory. By the time it was liberated in 1945, over 32,000 people had died there. And those are just the ones who made the paperwork. We already covered the horrors of the final solution. So what else could there possibly be? Well, for one, medical experiments. Prisoners were pulled from their bunks and marched into clinics, where men in lab coats acted more like executioners than doctors. Prisoners were stripped naked and dunked in vats of icy water, left to freeze in the open air, or subjected to insane high-altitude simulations where their lungs suffered great damage and their bodies convulsed from rapid decompression. All of this was done to see how long German pilots might survive in the cold or thin air. Most of the prisoners didn't survive at all. Then came the revivals. If the cold didn't kill them, victims were dumped into scalding baths or by forcing women to lie with them while they were still very much unconscious. There were also malaria experiments. Hundreds of Polish priests and other inmates were deliberately infected, just so Nazi doctors could take notes while they died. Some were also infected with festering pus-filled wounds known as phlegmons. Others were simply beaten to death or worked until their bodies collapsed. When the camp was finally liberated, about a third of the prisoners were too sick to walk, and the Nazis tried to cover their tracks by burning records blaming typhus and pneumonia. But testimonies and surviving documents exposed the horror. The Gulag Purges. In the heat of war, Stalin's regime conducted purges so brutal that even loyal generals were dragged out in the middle of the night and shot. If hell had a bureaucracy, it'd probably look like the Soviet Gulag. On paper, it was a correctional labor system, a sort of prison/workforce for the motherland. In reality, it was a massive network of punishment camps scattered across the frozen wastelands of Siberia and beyond. These camps were built on fear, forced labor, and a whole lot of human suffering. From the 1930s to the early 1950s, under Stalin's iron rule, millions were swept into this system. Some were actual criminals, but a huge chunk were guilty of nothing more than telling the wrong joke or thinking a little too freely for Stalin's taste. The Gulag didn't care much about innocence. Trials were optional. Instead, they had these little troikas, which were basically kangaroo courts made up of 3 guys with too much power and too little time, who'd decide your fate in minutes. Once you were tagged, you vanished. Trains would drop you in the middle of nowhere. Usually some frozen wasteland where winter wasn't just cold, it was straight up petty. The kind of place where your breath would freeze before it left your mouth. The camps were surrounded by nothing, just forests, ice, and the kind of cold that made escape a death sentence. Inside, it was brutal. Prisoners had to work or die trying. Logging, mining, building entire cities with nothing but hand tools and desperation. Nothing was off limits, especially during the war, when food ran low and the state decided prisoners could survive on fewer calories. Or not at all. Some camps cut meals so harshly that prisoners dropped dead by the hundreds each month. Disease, starvation, and cold were constant, and sanitation was a joke. If you worked hard enough, you might earn less time, more food, or even a mattress if you were lucky. Some camps had newspapers, theater troupes, and football teams. Others had machine guns on towers and mass graves in the back. Survival often depended on luck, silence, and whether your body could outlast the work. By the time Stalin died, millions had passed through the Gulag, and at least 1.5 million never made it out. Unit 731. In Japanese-occupied Manchuria, there was Unit 731, a military unit disguised as a research facility that turned science into a tool for torture. Built in 1936 and run by General Shiro Ishii, this place was all about perfecting biological warfare, and it did so by turning thousands of living, breathing humans into lab rats. And get this, calling them humans would have upset the staff, so they had a different name, logs, as if the people they experimented on were items on a list to be checked off daily. Behind those walls in Harbin, China, people were infected with the plague, anthrax, typhoid, you name it. They were frozen solid to test frostbite remedies. Then their limbs were smashed like blocks of ice. Some victims were pumped full of seawater to see if it could be a blood substitute. Others had their stomachs cut out and intestines rerouted while they were still alive, all without anesthesia. Pregnant women were deliberately infected just to see if certain diseases would pass to their babies. and when it was time to examine the results, the same women were sliced open. Some babies were kept alive in cages for further tests. Others were preserved in jars. The dissections were a daily affair. One doctor remembered cutting into a screaming man infected with the plague, and he said it was just another day at the office. Another researcher confessed that he preferred stuffing rags in people's mouths before the cutting began to keep the screaming down. A few were forced to freeze to death while being filmed. After Japan surrendered, the U.S. quietly offered immunity to many Unit 731 scientists in exchange for their biological warfare data. No trials, no accountability. Most of the world never heard a word about it. The world powers bury the crimes so deeply that many still haven't heard of them. Nazi occultism. You've probably heard that the Nazis had a thing for the occult. At first, it sounds like some made-up Hollywood propaganda. But here's the thing, it wasn't all fiction. By the time Hitler was giving intense speeches and setting the world on fire, people already felt like something wasn't quite right. And to be fair, the Nazi leadership didn't do much to ease suspicions. They were openly using ancient symbols, referencing mythologies, and mixing mysticism straight into their fascism like it was part of the user manual. As a result, some people believed they were deep into black magic, to the point they were obsessed with secret societies, hidden knowledge, and the idea that supernatural forces were guiding their rise. It all sounds far-fetched, but it wasn't completely random. A lot of this came from a belief system called Ariosophy. It was a mix of racial theory and mystical ideas that was floating around in Germany and Austria before the Nazis came to power. Himmler, one of Hitler's top men, really bought into it. He believed in ancient Aryan bloodlines and tried to turn the SS into a Death Eater cosplay group powered by ancient space racism. He even used runes and myths to make the group feel like it had some spiritual importance. The Nazis also searched for relics, information about lost civilizations, and stories about ancient warriors. They genuinely believed this kind of knowledge could help them win the war, or at least give their movement some sort of historical and mystical weight. It wasn't just about military power. They wanted to believe they were part of something older, something bigger. They didn't invent these ideas, but they used them to add depth to their twisted worldview. After the war, Nazi occultism mutated into its own genre. Part conspiracy theory, part paranormal fanfic. Writers began to suggest that Hitler wasn't just evil. He was under the influence of dark forces. Some even claimed he'd learned black magic as a child, or that he was following some apocalyptic prophecy. It all got a bit dramatic. Historian Nicholas Goodrick Clark looked into the origins of these stories. He confirmed that yes, there were real occult influences, but most of the more extreme claims like demonic possession or spellbooks were exaggerated or invented later on. Still, the stories suck. Even now, places like the Hoska Castle in the Czech Republic attract curious visitors who walk through the halls whispering about Nazi experiments, demons in the basement, and the idea that the Third Reich might have been more than just politics. British black propaganda. Demons might not have been whispering in Hitler's ear, but the Brits definitely were. And they had better scripts. What they were doing was something sneakier. They were spreading black propaganda, which is fake news dressed up in enemy colors. It's when you spread misinformation while pretending it's coming from your enemy, just to mess with people's heads. Unlike traditional propaganda that proudly waves its flags and tells you exactly what to believe, black propaganda doesn't yell. It just nods along, borrows your voice, and stabs you in the back mid-sentence. And by the time you realize it's a lie, if you ever do, the damage will have already been done. Enter Sefton Delmer, the unofficial king of British black propaganda, a journalist turned wartime mischief maker. Delmer spoke German so fluently he could have passed for a Berlin native. And that's exactly what he did, on air. One of his most infamous creations was the Soldatensender Calais, a fake German military radio station. On the surface, it sounded legit. Patriotic tunes, Hitler speeches, the usual. But between the songs and speeches, Delmer would drop little bombs, rumors about officers hoarding supplies or sleeping with soldiers' wives. Just enough to stir resentment. The genius part of it all was that German soldiers had no clue it was British. Another project, Gustav Siegfried I, was even more aggressive. It featured a fake Nazi insider, Der Chef, ranting about how corrupt and cowardly Hitler's circle had become. He wasn't real, of course, but his angry, frustrated tone struck a nerve. It felt like someone from the inside finally saying what everyone else was thinking. And that was the point. And then there was the rumor about Shingle Street. The Germans, helped along by anonymous sources, had tried to invade Britain and got absolutely wrecked. The bodies were supposedly torched. The beach turned into a bloodbath. Except none of it happened. Total fiction. Tactical fiction. Still, the story spread through neutral countries, made its way into American newspapers, and boosted the idea that Britain could hold its own. That little lie may have helped tip the scales toward U.S. support. Operation Paperclip. Right at the messy end of World War II, as Germany's empire crumbled and the ashes of the Third Reich still floated through the air, the United States made a smooth move. It was called Operation Paperclip, a secret, brain-snatching mission to vacuum up Nazi scientists before the Soviets could get their hands on them. The goal was to win the next big war, the Cold War, using minds once devoted to Hitler's cause. These lab nerds were deeply entangled in Nazi crimes. Take Wernher von Braun, for example. The guy who later became a member of NASA once built rockets for Hitler. Rockets that were tested with slave labor and rained down on civilians. But instead of facing judgment, he and over 1,600 others were whisked away to cozy jobs in America. Some even got to bring their families along. The US wanted their rocketry secrets, but these Nazi brains also had insights into chemical weapons, biological experiments, aeronautics, and in some cases, torture-based medical research. So how exactly did they know who to target? Well, you know how they say all great ideas begin with a toilet? Fragments of the infamous Iceberg list, which was basically a Nazi VIP scientist directory, were found stuffed in a toilet at Bonn University. That list was passed to Allied intelligence, and it became the blueprint for who got scooped up. Operation Paperclip helped launch the US into the space age, sure, but it also blurred every moral line in existence and made heroes of war criminals turned Cold War assets. While Americans cheered moon landings and missile breakthroughs, they did so thanks to the minds behind some of history's darkest horrors. Tier 3. Japanese Cannibalism. By the time the war was grinding into its later years, things went from desperate to downright unthinkable. On a lonely island in the Pacific called Chichijima, in September 1944, 9 American pilots were shot down during bombing raids. 8 were captured by Japanese troops. Only 1 made it out alive. George H.W. Bush. Yeah, that George Bush. He went on to become the 41st president of the U.S., while the others who weren't as lucky became victims of one of the most horrifying war crimes ever committed. The captured airmen were tortured, beaten, and then executed. But it didn't stop there. Japanese officers, under the command of Lieutenant General Yoshio Tachibana, didn't stop at killing the men. They went on to cook and eat parts of their bodies. And this wasn't the act of one rogue lunatic. It was coordinated from the top down. 4 of the airmen had their livers and thighs cut out and served up. Some sources claim it was for medical reasons, while others say that it might have been part of a ritual or occult act. But when you're slicing up prisoners and passing around body parts, the reasons, whatever they are, kind of lose their meaning. Cannibalism wasn't entirely unheard of among Japanese troops on starving islands, but what made this particular incident stand out was the level of cold-blooded intent. These weren't desperate soldiers. They were doctors and officers casually turning prisoners into dinner. When the war ended, the truth spilled out during trials. Tachibana and several others were hanged for murder and denied honorable burial. But oddly enough, cannibalism wasn't technically a war crime at the time, so they were prosecuted for everything except eating people. Worse, Chichijima wasn't even unique. Across the Pacific, starving Japanese troops were cutting up locals and Allied prisoners alike. In New Guinea, soldiers from a battalion that had been ravaged by hunger were suspected of eating a villager just before surrendering. There were also reports of some units butchering their own dead. Death marches. By late 1944, the Nazi Empire was crumbling fast, but they weren't about to let go of their skeletons quietly. They couldn't leave living proof of their war crimes just hanging around. Hence the death marches. The marches were mass forced evacuations of concentration camp prisoners that doubled as an inhumane attempt at house cleaning. With the Red Army closing in from the east and the Allies from the west, the Nazis started dragging their prisoners on endless treks through snow, ice, and starvation, trying to hide what they'd done and squeeze out whatever labor they could before the end. They were slow, freezing, and fatal parades of death. Prisoners from places like Auschwitz, Stutthof, and Ravensbrück, who were little more than skin and bones after years of starvation, disease, and torture, were told to walk up to 35 miles a day into dead of winter with no food, no rest, and no shoes that fit. They marched through villages, forests, and icy rail tracks, often towards train stations where they would be crammed into cattle cars with no heat, no water, and no dignity, only to be dumped out again and marched even further. Anyone who stumbled or lagged behind would either be shot to death or left on the spot to die. In January 1945, the biggest of the marches began. 56,000 prisoners were shoved out of Auschwitz as the Soviets approached. Around 15,000 of them didn't make it. Some froze where they fell. Others were executed for collapsing in the snow. Some were just shoved into rivers and gunned down, like killing them was easier than feeding them a few more days. The SS guards may have claimed that they were trying to move people, but what they were really trying to do was erase evidence. Camps were burned and records destroyed, bodies buried or left behind in frozen heaps. But some survivors did make it, and their stories are the only reason we know just how horrifying the marches really were. People like Elie Wiesel, who wrote of dragging himself through the snow with his dying father beside him. Katyn Massacre. In the spring of 1940, while most of the world was distracted by the chaos already brewing across Europe, the Soviet NKVD, aka the USSR's secret police, were quietly rounding up thousands of Polish officers, intellectuals, and public servants. Pretty much anyone the Soviets thought might one day raise a fuss about Poland being carved up like a holiday ham between Hitler and Stalin. Many of them had been captured the previous autumn during the Soviet invasion of eastern Poland. At first, they thought they were being relocated. They were interrogated, shuffled between camps, and held in miserable, freezing barracks. Then came the orders from Stalin himself. These men were enemies of the state, all 22,000 of them, and death was the penalty for their crimes. The execution process was chillingly efficient. One by one, prisoners were marched into a soundproof room padded with sandbags. The executioner would shoot each man in the back of the head, dump the body out of a back door, and bring in the next. Vasily Blokhin, Stalin's top killer, personally executed over 7,000 men in Kalinin. He did this every night for nearly a month, wearing a leather butcher's apron and gloves to keep the blood off his uniform. The Soviets used German pistols for the job, because their own revolvers hurt the executioner's wrist after the first dozen kills. Mass graves were dug in the forests of Katyn, Kharkiv, and Kalinin, beneath the pine trees. When the Nazis discovered the Katyn site in 1943, they turned it into a propaganda tool. They blamed the Soviets and invited international observers to see the horrors. Stalin responded by cutting ties with the Polish government in exile, claiming the Nazis had done it, and the lie held up for nearly 50 years. Lebensborn. While bombs fell across Europe and soldiers dug into trenches, Heinrich Himmler had his own little side quest. Sure, he wanted to conquer territory, but he also wanted to engineer a new race that fit in his twisted vision of Aryan perfection. And that's when Lebensborn came in. Lebensborn was a so-called welfare program for struggling mothers, but under the hood, it was a eugenics project. Privately, it was more like a state-sanctioned breeding program, complete with pedigree checks, adoption forms, and a whole lot of Nazi eugenics. It started small in 1935. Just a few maternity homes where carefully selected, racially valuable women could give birth in peace. Most of them were unwed. Some were volunteers, others were pressured. SS officers were encouraged to father these children. But behind the crisp sheets and sanitized bottles was a sinister mission to flood Germany with pure Aryan babies. If you were blonde, blue-eyed, and your family tree had no blemishes, the SS had a crib ready for your kind. Some women even volunteered to bear children for SS officers. But the real horror started when Germany decided it needed more than just the good stock at home. That's when Lebensborn took its mission on tour. In occupied countries like Poland and Norway, SS agents began abducting children who looked Aryan from orphanages, hospitals, and even directly from their parents. The toddlers were measured, prodded, and tested like livestock. Those who passed the racial inspections were renamed, brainwashed, and shipped off to German families. Those who didn't make the cut were deported, sent to camps, or simply vanished. Estimates say tens of thousands, possibly over 200,000 children were taken this way. Though exact numbers are murky because the Nazis torched the records when they realized that the Allies were coming. After the war, Many of these children had no memory of who they really were, just a false name and a vague sense that something was wrong. German camp brothels. As if forced labor, starvation, and mass murder weren't enough, the Nazis decided to set up makeshift brothels inside the camps themselves. Officially, they were meant to motivate prisoners to work at Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Dachau. But of course, that was only half the story. The brothels were called joy divisions, and they weren't open to just anyone. Only favored prisoners, career criminals, informants, Nazi collaborators were allowed in. Jewish prisoners were banned because Nazi racism never took a day off. Unlike the Lebensborn program where some women volunteered because they believed they were doing their part for the Reich, brothel women had no real choice. Many of them were taken from Ravensbrück, the largest women's camp. In Auschwitz, they used women who were already imprisoned there. None volunteered. Many were lured in with false promises of better rations, less backbreaking labor, and a shorter sentence. What they got instead was humiliation, trauma, and a brutal routine. Inside these barracks turned brothels, the women were assigned strict schedules. The guards matched them with men, and the clients paid with coupons or Reichsmarks. And the women got nothing but trauma, disease, and the constant threat of death. There are reports that some women were tattooed with the words Feldur, which means field, and you can probably guess the second word. Others were forcibly sterilized or subjected to brutal abortions. At one point, Himmler even used the brothels as conversion therapy, forcing gay prisoners to participate in hopes of curing them. It didn't work, of course, but it does give you a glimpse into just how warped Nazi logic really was. For decades, no one talked about these places. They weren't in the history books or documentaries. It took survivor memoirs and bold researchers in the 90s to drag this nightmare into the light. Ohrdruf. By late 1944, buried deep in the frozen guts of Nazi Germany, a new kind of hell opened up in Thuringia. It was called Ohrdruf. On paper, Ohrdruf was just a subcamp of Buchenwald. But don't let the term subcamp fool you. It was every bit as brutal as the worst of them. Originally a military training ground with huts for Wehrmacht troops, the site was rebranded into a death trap for thousands of forced laborers. Their mission was to build tunnels and railways for some top-secret Nazi project buried beneath Mühlberg Castle. Rumors said it was supposed to be Hitler's underground command center, or, depending on who you asked, even a testing ground for a nuclear bomb. That's how deep the madness ran. Prisoners came in waves. Russians, Poles, Jews, Italians, Greeks, anyone the Nazis didn't like. There were no beds and no toilets, just straw crawling with lice and soaked in blood. Some prisoners slept in barns, while others were thrown into freezing tents. Work shifts stretched up to 14 hours a day. If you dropped, you died. If you slowed down, you were beaten or shot. The place was so stripped of basic humanity that even latrines were optional. Then came January 1945, and with it, a fresh wave of SS guards from eastern camps like Auschwitz. As if things weren't already bad enough, by March, Ohrdruf was holding nearly 20,000 prisoners, most of whom were barely alive. Those too weak to work were sent to the Sterbelager, which was literally the death camp section. If you couldn't walk, the SS didn't wait for nature to finish you off. They'd march you to the parade ground, tell you food was coming, then shoot you and leave your body to rot where you fell. As American forces closed in and the SS scrambled to erase the evidence, they dug up mass graves and burned bodies on railway tracks used as makeshift pyres. But it was too late. On April 4, 1945, the 4th Armored Division and 89th Infantry rolled in and walked straight into a nightmare. What they found was so horrifying, General Eisenhower, Patton, and Bradley came to see it with their own eyes. Bodies were stacked like firewood, and the corpses were dusted in lime. Half-dead survivors could barely speak, so they mimed the torture they'd been through. Even hardened American soldiers broke down. Some cried, while others just threw up. Ohrdruf was the first Nazi camp that the U.S. liberated, and the horror was so undeniable that Eisenhower personally made sure journalists and politicians came to see it, just so nobody could ever say it didn't happen. Tier 4. V-1 Flying Bomb. Just as the Allies were catching their breath after D-Day, the sky started buzzing. Literally, the Germans had cooked up a new nightmare. The V-1 Flying Bomb, better known as the Buzz Bomb, Doodlebug, or if you're feeling dramatic, Hellhound. It was the world's first cruise missile, and it sounded like a giant mosquito from hell. People in London learned fast. If you heard the buzz, you were still safe. The second it stopped, you had maybe 10 seconds to pray. At first, the V-1 bombs weren't dropped from planes. They were launched from hidden ramps tucked along the French and Dutch coasts. A chemical steam catapult would fling them into the sky like something from a cartoon, except this cartoon ended with buildings blown to rubble. They weren't precise, they weren't sleek, but they were cheap, fast to build, and terrifying. Between June 1944 and March 1945, more than 10,000 V-1s were fired, most aimed at London and later Belgium. Hospitals, homes, schools, and anything unlucky enough to be in their path was fair game. Survivors said the silence that came after a V-1 drop was worse than the sound. Once they spotted one approaching, British defenses scrambled to respond with fighter planes, anti-aircraft guns, and even barrage balloons. The goal was to do everything possible to knock these missiles out before they found a target. To make sure nobody could get their hands on a dud, the Germans added a third fuse to blow the whole thing up if it didn't hit anything. Battle of Tarawa. Tarawa was supposed to be the quick pit stop on the road to Tokyo. The Americans thought they had it all mapped out. They had the firepower, the numbers, and a solid plan. What they didn't count on were the Japanese troops who'd been ordered to fight to the last man to defend the island. At dawn on November 20, 1943, U.S. Navy battleships began pounding Bataan, the main island of Tarawa. The idea was simple: blast the island so hard that nothing was left to shoot back. And while the shelling did kill a lot of defenders, it didn't kill nearly enough. The Japanese had spent months digging deep. They had reinforced bunkers, concrete pillboxes, and firing trenches. When the Marines landed, those positions were still very much intact and fully manned. Then nature betrayed them. The tide stayed too low. Higgins's boats bottomed out on the reef, forcing hundreds of Marines to jump into waist-deep water and wade nearly 500 yards across open reef, all under relentless machine gun fire. It was a massacre before they even hit the sand. Some LVTs that tracked alligators made it to the beach, but were torn apart by artillery. Survivors crouched behind a flimsy log seawall, pinned down and bleeding out under the blazing sun. One Marine said it was like walking into a buzzsaw. Whole squads just disappeared. Tanks tried to land, but sank into shell holes or got destroyed before they could even fire. Then came Colonel Shoup, wounded, furious, and somehow still standing. He stormed ashore and led the attack straight into hell, inch by bloody inch. The Marines clawed their way forward. Bayonets cleared bunkers while grenades cleared trenches. Nobody was spared. By the end of day 3, it was over. Tarawa was taken, but at a horrifying cost. Nearly 6,400 people, including Japanese, Korean laborers, and Americans, died fighting over a speck of coral just 2 miles long and less than a mile wide. Operation Flintlock. After the bloodbath at Tarawa, the U.S. military decided it was time to work smarter, not harder. Charging headfirst into island fortresses clearly wasn't ideal, especially when you could just sneak past the worst of it. That mindset gave birth to Operation Flintlock, a January 1944 assault on the Marshall Islands, where the Japanese had been squatting since World War I. By now, the Japanese knew what was coming, but instead of loading up the islands America actually wanted, they scattered their troops across outer atolls. It was a bold strategy, but it didn't exactly work out the way they hoped it would. You see, American codebreakers had been eavesdropping for months and knew exactly where to strike. Majuro came first. It was practically abandoned, so there was no gunfire and no bloodshed. Just a peaceful walk ashore. The real nightmare started at Kwajalein, where more than 8,000 Japanese troops waited behind bunkers, trenches, and buried spider holes. These were not guys looking to surrender. They were told to fight to the last man, and they took that job seriously. When the Americans landed, the ground exploded. But some hidden bunkers survived, even after days of naval and air bombardments. By the time it was over, only a handful of Japanese defenders were still breathing, and they were too injured to keep fighting. The Americans suffered too, but this time their brutal efficiency paid off. Up next was Enueto, and if you thought Kwajalein was hard, this one was a whole new level. As the war raged on, the beach turned blood red. Out of 4,000 defenders, barely 100 were captured alive. The rest were vaporized, burned, or shredded. By the end of February, the U.S. had secured the Marshalls, and with the Marshalls in hand, America had its launching pad to bomb Tokyo into dust. Tanya Savicheva. During the siege of Leningrad, when food was scarcer than hope and winter felt like an executioner, an 11-year-old girl named Tanya Savicheva quietly wrote herself into history. Tanya's diary was a death toll as her family dropped off one by one. The siege had turned Leningrad into a starvation camp sealed by snow. The Savichevs, like thousands of others, had no choice but to stay. Her siblings dug trenches and worked brutal shifts at ammunition factories, while her mother stitched uniforms until her fingers bled. Tanya, barely over a decade old, spent her days putting out fire bombs with the other Leningrad children. Then the dying began. It started with Zhenya, her oldest sister. She'd been working double shifts at the munitions plant, giving blood to the front line, and surviving on 250 grams of bread a day. Her body just gave out. Nina, another sister, vanished during an air raid. Tanya didn't know she had been evacuated across the frozen highway known as the Road of Life. Everyone assumed she was dead. Then Grandma went next. Her heart stopped on a freezing January night. But the family kept her ration card a little longer. Leka, her brother, made it to March. He had been too nearsighted to enlist, but still worked long hours in a freezing shipyard. His body finally gave out too. Then came Uncle Vasya, who once filled his apartment with books and was like a second father to Tanya. Next was Uncle Lesha, then Mama. Each death was scribbled down in Tanya's notebook like a cold, miserable tally. Zhenya died. Grandma died. Leka died. Uncle Vasya died. Uncle Lesha, May 10. Mama, May 13. The final 3 pages had no name and no dates. Just the words. The Savichevs are dead. Everyone is dead. Only Tanya is left. But even that wasn't true for long. After being rescued and sent to an orphanage, Tanya did not recover. She was too far gone. The hunger had gnawed through her insides, and tuberculosis finished the job. She died in 1944, at 14 years old, and her diary was later presented at the Nuremberg trials as evidence to Nazi cruelty. Cowra escaped. By 1944, World War II had reached deep into the Australian outback, where a sleepy little town called Cowra suddenly became the setting for one of the bloodiest prison escapes in modern history. At first glance, the Cowra prisoners of war camp might have looked like just another dusty, fenced-in compound tucked into nowhere. But inside, tensions were simmering like a volcano about to erupt. Over 1,000 Japanese prisoners of war were held there, packed in among Italians, Germans, Koreans, and even Indonesians. The Australians in charge were mostly veterans too old for frontline combat, or young boys who were trained for guard duty but deemed unfit for battle. On paper, the camp followed the Geneva Convention. In practice, it was a powder keg. Things boiled over on the night of August 5, 1944. Word had leaked that the Japanese prisoners, except officers, were being shipped off to another camp. To many of the prisoners, this wasn't just relocation. It was humiliation. And worse, it was a dishonor. So they made a choice, not to live under the shame of capture, but to die trying to reclaim their dignity. What came next was total chaos. At 2 a.m., a warning shout echoed through the dark. A bugle blasted. Then came the screaming. Banzai! Hundreds of prisoners surged forward, throwing blankets over barbed wire fences and charging at the guards with handmade weapons. Things like clubs, sharpened wires, and garrotes. Some even had baseball bats with nails driven into them. Perhaps the most terrifying part of this incident is that the Japanese prisoners were not looking to win, just to die fighting. The guards fired into the darkness, mowing down rows of SKPs. 2 Australian soldiers, Hardy and Jones, manned a Vickers machine gun until they were overwhelmed. But before dying, Hardy yanked the bolt out of the gun so the prisoners couldn't turn it on his comrades. Fires lit up the compound as screams cut through the night. Some prisoners who escaped ran straight into the bush, only to slit their own throats rather than be recaptured. Fellow prisoners killed others for not being honorable enough. By the end, 231 Japanese were dead. 4 Australians too. Every SKP was recaptured within 10 days. Fall of Bataan. The fall of Bataan didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, brutal collapse. For 3 months, American and Filipino soldiers clung to the Bataan Peninsula like their lives depended on it. Because they did. Starving, sick, outgunned, and surrounded, they dug into the jungle and held the line with whatever scraps of strength they had left. They weren't just fighting the Japanese. They were battling hallucinations from hunger and the realization that no one was coming to save them. Their generals had been promised supplies, reinforcements, and even air support, but none of it came. Manila had already fallen, so the only thing standing between Japan and total control of the Philippines was this battered scrap of jungle, and it was falling apart fast. On April 3rd, 1942, the Japanese launched their final push. They blasted the Bataan line with nearly 200 artillery pieces, followed by wave after wave of bombers. Trees exploded, trenches disappeared, and some soldiers straight up vanished in the chaos. The Japanese infantry came next. They climbed up Mount Summit and cut through the crumbling Allied lines. Filipino divisions cracked first, not because they were cowards, but because they were just done. Many of them hadn't eaten properly in weeks. By April 5th, the Japanese troops had reached the summit of Mount Summit. From there, it was a straight shot to the rest of Bataan. The Americans tried to fight back, but it was hopeless. The men just couldn't move fast enough. Some couldn't walk at all. Their bodies were wrecked from months of jungle warfare and starvation. By April 9th, the writing was on the wall. General Edward King surrendered, hoping to save lives. And technically he did, but he also handed 75,000 troops over to what would become one of the worst war crimes of the 20th century, the Bataan Death March. But that's a whole other nightmare. For now, just imagine this. Men collapsed in dirt, crying, broken, too weak to stand, and too afraid to guess what came next, and the jungle falling silent. Almost like it knew the worst was yet to come. Bataan Death Marches. When the dust settled after the brutal Battle of Bataan, the surviving American and Filipino troops weren't met with mercy. Instead, they were told to march. Over 70,000 starving, wounded, and exhausted soldiers were forced to walk 65 miles, with little food and almost no water. The Japanese expected maybe 25,000 prisoners tops. Instead, they got more than double that amount. And their solution was to line them up and move them like cattle, from Mariveles and Bagak to a train station in San Fernando. And then make them walk the final miles to Camp O'Donnell. Except march is way too soft a word. This was slow motion slaughter. If a prisoner stumbled or couldn't get up, they were shot, stabbed, or beheaded right where they fell. Some prisoners were tied up and left under the scorching sun with no cover. It was called the sun treatment, and it resulted in death by dehydration and heat stroke. Hundreds of Filipino officers were executed at Pantingan River just because they held rank. Some guards even started ripping out gold filings from the prisoners' teeth like they were cashing in at a pawn shop. When the march finally ended at the train station, things got worse. The men were crammed into metal boxcars with no window, air, or toilets. They were left to their own devices in 110-degree heat. As you would imagine, many never made it off the train. The final 9-mile walk to Camp O'Donnell turned out to be the final cruelty in a long parade of misery. By the time the survivors arrived, an estimated 10,000 of their comrades were dead. And even at the camp, the dying didn't stop. Tier 5. Trained anti-tank dogs. While America was landing in North Africa and Germany was chewing through the Eastern Front, the Soviets were busy strapping bombs to dogs. Not metaphorically, literally. They literally trained dogs to blow up tanks. Believe it or not, it started out as a noble idea. In the 1920s and 30s, the Soviet military imagined canine commandos, delivering meds, rescuing soldiers, snuffing out mines. Then it got darker, much darker. As the Nazis pushed east in 1941, the Soviets needed something, anything that could stop the endless metal beasts rolling through their villages. So they turned man's best friend into a 4-legged suicide bomber. The original plan was a tad bit kinder, at least to the dogs. All they had to do was run up to the enemy tanks, drop off a bomb, and then scurry back to safety before it went boom. But that was too complicated. Some dogs froze, others ran the wrong way. A few, bless them, came sprinting back to their handlers with live bombs still strapped on. So the Soviets ditched the return trip. Instead, they rigged the dogs with bomb vests, trigger sticks, and a one-way mission. Dive under a tank, hit the chassis, explode on contact. Training was cruel. The dogs were starved and taught to associate food with crawling under tanks. But there was one huge problem. They trained the dogs on Soviet diesel tanks. German tanks used gasoline. Guess which tank smelled right in battle? Yeah, the dogs ran under friendly tanks, or worse, panicked and ran home, detonating inside Soviet trenches. In one operation, they sent out 30 dogs. 4 hit German tanks. 6 blew up inside Soviet lines. The rest ran or got shot. Trainers started refusing to work. Some had to shoot their own dogs mid-retreat. And if they complained, Military intelligence made sure they didn't complain again. Despite claims that hundreds of tanks were destroyed, historians think the real number was closer to a dozen. A dozen tanks, thousands of dead dogs, and an ethical nightmare that smells like gasoline and gunpowder. By 1942, the Soviets pulled the plug on the operation. Navajo Code Talkers. By the time American boots hit the sands of the Pacific, World War II had turned into a brutal test of who could outwit, outlast, and outgun the other. Every crackle over a radio could either save a battalion or march them straight into a trap. And when machines couldn't keep up with the chaos, the military turned to something no algorithm could crack: the Navajo language. Navajo wasn't just rare, it was a linguistic fortress. It wasn't written, had layers of complex grammar, and twisted so uniquely that even expert linguists were left scratching their heads. For the US Marines, that made it perfect. Enter Philip Johnston, a World War I vet who'd grown up on a Navajo reservation. He didn't speak it fluently, but he knew just enough to realize its value. He came up with the idea to enlist the help of Navajo speakers to create a military code so foreign and uncrackable, the Japanese wouldn't even know where to start. The Marines gave it a shot. They recruited 29 Navajo men, threw them into boot camp, and then handed them a job no one had done before. They were to build an entirely new code, using a language that was never designed for war. Some of the terms were clever substitutions. Shark meant destroyer. Ironfish meant submarine. But a lot of it required straight-up invention. After all, there were no Navajo words for tanks, grenades, or fighter planes, so they built them from scratch. It worked. While cryptographers hunched over bulky machines, fiddling with gears and wires, these guys were firing off perfectly coded messages in seconds. But here's where it gets dark. The code was so vital, some code talkers were assigned Marine escorts, not to protect them from the enemy, but from their own side. They were sometimes mistaken for Japanese soldiers, and if capture seemed likely, the bodyguards had orders to kill them. That's how secret this was. At Iwo Jima, 6 Navajo code talkers relayed over 800 flawless messages. Major Connor later said that the Marines wouldn't have taken the island without them. The code was never cracked, and most of the men who carried it weren't even recognized for decades. Japanese occupation of Kiska. When people think of World War II, they don't usually imagine a ghost island wrapped in fog, filled with abandoned guns and frozen corpses. But that's exactly what Kiska became. It started in June 1942, when Japanese troops stormed ashore to take this remote patch of land in Alaska's Aleutian chain. The only Americans there were a 12-man weather station crew, a couple of whom who weren't even on the island at the time, and one very unlucky dog named Explosion. The Japanese hit fast, killing 2 men and capturing the rest. One guy, William House, managed to escape into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on his back. For 50 brutal days, he ate moss, plants, and bugs just to stay alive. He eventually shrunk down to 80 pounds before finally surrendering. The prisoners got shipped off to Japan, leaving the island in Japanese hands. The plan behind all this was to use Kiska as a northern outpost. After the Doolittle raid showed Japan just how vulnerable they were to American bombers, they freaked out and scrambled to block off potential entry points. Kiska and nearby Attu were turned into icy fortresses. But the real terror didn't come until the Americans started trying to take them back. Frequent air raids hammered Kiska. American warships circled like sharks, blowing up every Japanese ship brave enough to approach. One battle alone left an estimated 200 Japanese soldiers dead at sea, when submarines and destroyers clashed just outside the harbor. And then there was USS Grunion, a submarine that disappeared. Many believe that the vessel was hit by its own malfunctioning torpedo. Death by friendly fire, but underwater. Eventually, in July 1943, the Japanese pulled off a wild escape. Under the cover of thick fog, a convoy of cruisers and destroyers slipped in and plucked 5,000 soldiers off the island right under America's nose. The Allies didn't even realize they were gone. When US and Canadian forces finally landed in August, they expected a fight. What they got was silence. And then, chaos. In the fog, soldiers shot each other by mistake. Mines and traps also did their fair share of killing. Even without a single Japanese soldier left, Kiska still killed over 100 men. Operation Mincemeat. Just when you think war can't get any weirder, the British decide to win a battle using a corpse. In 1943, British intelligence cooked up a bizarre plan called Operation Mincemeat. The goal was to trick the Nazis into thinking the Allies would invade Greece, not Sicily. They would dress up as a dead man, dump him off the coast of Spain, and hope the Germans fall for the paperwork in his pocket. The body they used didn't belong to a fallen soldier or some hero of the Empire. It was Glyndwr Michael, a poor Welsh drifter, who died after eating rat poison. British spies thought he was perfect for the mission. He was underweight and looked like he hadn't eaten well in weeks. But apparently that was fine. He didn't need to look like a soldier, just someone used to sitting behind a desk. They refrigerated the body, just cold enough to delay rot, not so cold it gave away the scam. But time was ticking. They had roughly 3 months to act before the whole operation started smelling very literally rotten. The next step was to build a new identity for him. He became Major William Martin, and he had a girlfriend named Pam who was played by a secretary from MI5. British intelligence put love letters in his pockets along with a theater ticket stub, bank overdraft notices, and even a receipt for an engagement ring. The attention to detail was insane. They even tested which inks could survive seawater so his fake mail wouldn't smear. And when they couldn't get a good ID photo of the dead man, they had someone alive pose for it. The corpse wore a used uniform and someone else's wool underwear, which weirdly might have been the most uncomfortable part of the mission. The body was packed in dry ice, loaded into a van by night, and driven to a submarine. On April 30th, 1943, it was dumped off the coast of Huelva, Spain. The fisherman who found him had no clue the soggy corpse in his net was part of an international gaslight attempt aimed at Hitler, and it worked. Steiner's counterattack. In the final days of World War II, while Berlin was being swallowed by Soviet tanks and desperation hung in the air like smoke, Hitler reached into his bag of delusions one last time and pulled out Army Detachment Steiner. Sounds impressive, right? Like some elite force ready to swoop in and save the day? In reality, the so-called army was a ragtag collection of battle-worn soldiers, Hitler Youth, reassigned Luftwaffe crew, and Kriegsmarine personnel with next to no infantry training. Their tanks were ancient captured French vehicles from 1940 that were outdated and wouldn't stand a chance against Soviet armor. Still, Hitler insisted they'd somehow launch a counterattack and drive back the Soviet forces that were steamrolling through the city. Steiner, a high-ranking SS officer, took one look at the troops under his command and realized it was hopeless. They had no air support, no artillery, and barely any functioning weapons. The reinforcements he and his men had been promised were either pinned down or had already been wiped out. Even the 4th SS Polizei Panzergrenadier Division didn't have enough boots on the ground to be useful. Still, orders were orders. Hitler pictured some glorious pincer move. Steiner attacking from the north, another force from the south, Soviets crushed in between. Except things didn't go the way Hitler hoped they would. Steiner decided he wasn't going to embark on Mission Impossible, so he phoned his superior and basically said, "Yeah, this is insane. We don't have enough men or weapons, so we're not doing it." Heinrichi, the regional commander, tried to pass that message up the chain, but basically rage quit the conversation. On April 22, the dam finally broke. In a room full of stunned generals, Hitler snapped. First, he was silent. Then he had a full meltdown. He admitted, for the first time out loud, that the war was lost. He blamed the generals, the army, and even fate itself. But deep down, he knew. In the end, Detachment Steiner never even made it to battle. So how did it all end? Well, by 1945, the Axis powers were basically falling apart at the seams. Hitler was hiding in a bunker, and the Allies were closing in from all sides. And Japan was refusing to back down, until the US dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Germany surrendered in May, Japan in August, and after intense final battles and negotiations, World War II was finally over. But over didn't mean neat and tidy. Europe was in ruins. Millions of people were dead or displaced, and the world had just gotten its first taste of nuclear warfare. The Nazis were gone, but the trauma stuck around. New superpowers rose, old ones crumbled, and the Cold War slid right into the spotlight like it had been waiting backstage the whole time. So yeah, World War II ended, but the fallout, that's a whole other iceberg. That's all we have for today. Don't forget to like and subscribe.